Okay, I'm not going to stand behind the lectern because it's not something I like doing. I like to move around. So, but I do have a pretty loud voice, so I'll be able to be picked up by the mic. So as Roman says, this is a story of my time during COVID, and one of the most important things was that the university gave me a certificate or permit to be able to go onto campus, so I can keep out of my wife's hair and my family's hair, and everybody was kept sane and safe. But the story is about using my ability and my interest in research in terms of manufacturing and creating something unique at our university in the context of making hand sanitizer. And I dedicated this speech, it's an adapted talk from the award lecture I gave when I received the Community Engagement Award. But I dedicated at that point to all the healthcare workers, and because this is the TIEMS conference, I've also included to all first responders who were working at the time. So it's not just healthcare, but ours was focusing on healthcare. It's also interesting that the WHO on it's the 5th of May every year has a World Hand Hygiene Day. And they've had it for a number of years. And the whole goal is to focus on improving hand cleanliness in healthcare professionals, which doesn't make sense. We'd think that they would know that this is what has to happen. So, so the common goal is of safety and quality of care, but we have to remind people about hand cleanliness. And I think this is one of the major ways of mitigating future diseases and spreading of diseases, is if we can not only get the mindset right for keeping hands clean, but also facilitating clean hands in all populations. So the context is there was COVID. Everybody went into a shutdown globally, and certainly in South Africa. At the time, there was a whole lot of misinformation going on, and I think communication was one of the things that was mentioned here as being an important component of emergency management. We needed better education. Hand sanitizer was one of the non-pharmaceutical interventions to prevent the spread of COVID. My work ended up culminating in a nomination, and I fortunately won an award for it, but it's not just me. I need to put a rider in here. This was not ever intended to be a community engagement project when it started. It has evolved subsequently into this. It was a need, an immediate need that then evolved over time into something much bigger. During that time, I had to think very carefully about how to do some of the things I was doing, solve some of the problems I was doing. I had research experience in making products on a large scale from sabbaticals and things like that, but here I was trying to help some people and healthcare professionals at short notice with limited resources and how to solve the problem. Subsequent to the COVID pandemic, some of what we're doing and we did has been integrated into teaching. And we've also spread the expertise to other research institutes in the Eastern Cape who are able to make sanitizer now as a result of that intervention. So it's also resulted in sharing of knowledge and that sort of thing. I'm going to cover these sorts of topics and this sort of outline. I'm not going to spend too much time. What we did in the past, some reflections, and where I think we should be going and what could be done. But I always tell people that I'm a pharmacist, and as a pharmacist, what I do is governed by a scope of practice as regulated by the South African Pharmacy Council. But part of it is, and I mean the education side of it, but part of it is to look at manufacturing of quality, safety, of quality, safe and effective medicines, and some supply chain management. So see, these are some of the skills we have, but people perceive pharmacists as being those people that read a prescription and hand over the tablets and they can stick and put a label on it. But we are much more than that. We are much, much more than that. And it's important that we realize that as part of the healthcare team, pharmacists have a very important role to play in a number of aspects of patient care. So there were partners and a whole lot of people involved in this project. It didn't start out like this. This is what it ended up as. There were pharmacists and a lot of people that worked in the Vichy office of the Department of Health, some healthcare professionals in the public sector, the South African Institute of Aquatic Biodiversity. Who would have thought people who research on fish would be part of this project? You'll learn about that shortly. Rhodes University, the Vice Chancellor, the Deputy Vice Chancellor supported the project. It was amazing to be able to have access to key people and say, I need to get this. And they would say, here's some money to buy something. And I'll share some of that story with you. One of the local NGOs was requiring make up food parcels to take to people in need. And one of their concerns was that they needed to provide them with hand sanitizer. So they procured raw materials, and I made sanitizer for that NGO to send to their communities that they were supporting. I wouldn't have been able to do this if the dean and the deputy dean and some other colleagues just had ignored what my requests were, and I had to ask them. I said, "Can I use the space?" And I got permission to use the Rhodes University space. If they hadn't have given me permission, I probably would have done it anyway and apologized afterwards. Chemistry department for all their help. Physics, I'll talk about the story with physics. How can a physics professor and a technician in physics help make sanitizer? And of course, one of our suppliers of equipment separations also were partners in one way, and I'll share that with you too. So the production started in 2020. Initially, it was a family-run business. It was myself, my children, my wife. They were printing labels. I was printing labels. They were cutting paper, contact paper to stick onto bottles, etc., etc. So it was a small cottage industry, so to speak. And subsequent to that, postgraduate students and undergraduate students were brought into the project as it expanded over 2021. To 2022. And these are some of the students and the names of the people that have made hand sanitizer in this project. So how did this start? I was teaching the 4th years in February 2020. I knew the WHO had guidelines about making hand sanitizer in pharmacies. But I received an email on Friday, the 6th of March at about 25 past 5 from a colleague in chemistry saying, "What do you think?" And he attached the guidelines. He said, "What do you think, Rod? Do you think you can we can make our own alcohol hand sanitizer solution?" And so Prof. Kraus was quite keen to get involved. So I didn't respond immediately. I gave some thought to this, and knowing that there's some issues with perhaps moving in this direction. From my pharmacy background, which is more important to think about here, because pharmacists are quite conservative people. And I said, well, this is quite simple to make. It's not very difficult, but we have to make it according to current good manufacturing practice guidelines. And the principle of CGMP is that you do what you say and document what you do. So you have to have SOPs and all these sorts of things, and then you have to have batch records and documentation. So I said to him, I don't think we can do this because this product is to be then used by people. And there's risk associated with that if there's no protocols in place. So I said, but we can go at risk. I like the word go at risk. Because you can say, well, we've got the raw materials, we can look at all the quality aspects of the materials, we can have a batch record, and we can have some documentation. And then we can control what we've got, but it's not CGMP, but it's unlikely, given the type of product we're making with 80% alcohol, to have a comeback. And it was people were in desperate need for hand sanitizer. I got hold of a colleague at Aspen Pharmacare, and I said, I'm looking for hydrogen peroxide, I'm looking for ethanol, I'm looking for glycerol. His response was, and so is the whole world. So that was the first problem. I made my first batch of 25 liters on the 20th of March, and it took about 3.5 hours to make, because we had to calibrate the vessels that I was using and things like that. So there's some controls going into place. So these are the sorts of things we had to worry about in the whole process. 25-liter containers for making hand sanitizer in. Ethanol, definitely, hydrogen peroxide, glycerol, water. We fortunately had supply of water, although because there have been leaks and floods in our building, they wanted to, the building was being vacated, they wanted to switch off the water to the building. So because no one was going to be in there, and I said, hang on a second, I need water. And so they had to divert the water supply to the lab that I make water in. I had to have a way of labeling bottles, mixing the product. I had to find contact paper, which all of a sudden became in short supply. I had to have some way of measuring the ethanol content or the isopropyl alcohol content in the product. And then the problem came is I can make the stuff, but how do I get rid of it? How do I distribute it? How do I pack it? So I bought the last 100 1-liter containers in Port Elizabeth, and then started worrying about how I'm going to do this. So we ended up getting 25-liter containers from a variety of sources, and 5-liter containers from a local dialysis clinic. Once they'd finished dialyzing patients, they use an aqueous solution for that dialysis process, and so it was easy to team that and reuse those containers. So there's some recycling happening in this process as well. The Bunya provided me with their containers, but people got upset with them because every time they sent it out, it looked like it was a cold drink bottle with a label on, and they said people are going to drink this stuff, it looks like it's a cold drink, but it was labeled appropriately and there was a need. So one has to mitigate the risk benefit of this process. And then distribution. How do you move sanitizer once you've made it? Fortunately, we had a partnership with the East Cape Department of Health. And the idea was that I would let Bishu know, the office in Bishu, that I've got X thousand liters or 500 liters to distribute. They would then get hold of the hospital will be getting hold of them to say, this is what we need. And they would send drivers to fetch. So I didn't have anything to do with distribution. So I can guarantee up until the time it was collected by the driver that they got what they were asking for. After that, I have no idea whether the full 100 liters or 500 liters got to the destination. But I didn't have any comment. The other important thing is that post this whole process, the South African Revenue Services came to visit me, wanting to know how much money I made out of selling hand sanitizer. And I said I made zero. I gave it away because we were using ethanol that is excise, it was excise free because it was used for research originally. The fire department and the municipality got involved because they were worried about me storing thousands of liters of alcohol-based products in a laboratory. So I had to turn the air-conditioned laboratory down to 15 degrees. So that sort of kept them happy. So there was all of this that happened just by the way. We didn't know that this was going to happen. This is what happened. All I was worried about was making hand sanitizer. So yes, some of the dates associated with the process. I developed a batch record. I looked at certificates of analysis. I was finding packaging. Got SOPs in place. I got hold of the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority and said, can I do this? What do I need to do if I'm going to make this and distribute it? They said nothing, because Rhodes University is registered as a pharmacy to educate pharmacists. And on that basis, I said, okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. We're a pharmacy. I can make hand sanitizer. And so I made hand sanitizer. 20th of March, we made 50 liters and packed into 1-liter containers, and you can see the containers here. And they were distributed to Rhodes University for Rhodes University use. But the person I distributed to at Rhodes got phone calls from local hospitals. Can we get some of this? Can we get some? We don't have. The Faculty of Pharmacy donated all their teaching PPE, masks, gloves, gowns that we would use for practicals that we couldn't operate with. And so they donated all of that to the Department of Health for local clinic and hospital use. 24th of March, I made 50 liters. 25th of March, 50 liters. And these were taking a long time because I was pumping the ethanol by hand. 25 liters of hand sanitizer requires 20.833 liters of ethanol. And so I was pumping that by hand, and it takes a long time. I've really got a strong bicep on my right arm. On the 26th, 27th, 28th, and 30th, I started making larger batches. These batches, at the time, I'd now got enough 25-liter containers, which were also in short supply. People were worried about water supplies, so I had to go and source containers. I got hold of the local community, said, do you have 25-liter water containers that you're not going to be using that I can use to make stuff? So we made 750 liters on those days. On the 31st of March, I got a few containers. So I could make 225 liters. And then in those dates in April, the total volume that we produced was 1,225 liters. On April the 20th, I'd managed to now procure enough containers, so 12 manufacturing vessels that I'd calibrated, and we made our first batch of 300 liters. And on the 29th of April 2020, we made 900 liters that day, which is quite remarkable given it's a small teaching space that we converted. But there's another problem here that I think needs to be highlighted. I was making hand sanitizer according to the WHO guidelines. There were a whole lot of other people making hand sanitizer and selling it at huge cost to the Department of Health and to other people wanting to buy sanitizer. So here are just two examples. The white plastic bottles were sold was put on tender to the Department of Health in the Eastern Cape, claiming to be 75% ethanol or alcohol. We tested this, and the three values there are 38, 38, and 57%. Supposed to have been 75%. They were selling anything between 185 to 500 rand a litre. Okay, so some municipalities were spending a lot of money to get nothing. The green bottles that looked like dishwashing liquid had a consistency of sunlight dishwashing liquid. You can see they're all different colors. The label that they put on it indicated that there was a banned substance in there. It's not for use on skin. The one bottle on the right of the slide shows a sediment, and the one with that I've circled that's got something floating in it, that looked remarkably like a blood spot to me. It looked like blood. Sold. They were never tested. They were sold on tender at huge cost. Dubious quality. So there was a lot of unethical practice happening during this, and I think that's very important to know, that we need to be careful of that going forward. So here are the partners: SIAB, South African Institute of Aquatic Biodiversity. How do fish people get involved? Well, they have the biggest wet fish library in Southern Africa, and they use ethanol to store their fish samples. And they weren't working, so they had a whole lot of ethanol that was not going to be used, so they donated ethanol. We had to have the SARS compliance because they refused to let me take the ethanol. They procured it for their purposes. They refused to let me have it unless I signed that I'm taking it over and I'm going to use it to make something that's going to be put to other use, etc. SARS had to give their permission, which they did. This is Dr. Angus Patterson and his team, and they were fantastic. I'd phone up and say, I need some more ethanol, and all of a sudden a truck would arrive with 1,000 liters of ethanol. Chemistry provided some raw materials and some heavy lifting. Our building is quite a strange building. It's got mezzanine floors. I learned everywhere how to get 250 liters of ethanol from the store to the third floor by using elevators going to one floor, putting it on a trolley, going to the next elevator, then going up another floor and coming backwards and forwards. It was quite an interesting experience. But I know everything in that building now. We needed, Rhodes provided the space. When I said to you I was pumping ethanol by hand, it was taking 3 hours to make a small batch. This was not going to be sustainable. So I found there's a local pump supplier, Albany Pumps, and I said, well, can you give me a pump to pump ethanol? They said, no problem. It'll cost you X amount. So then the guy wrote back to me and he said, no, we can't use that pump because it's got to be explosive proof because you're pumping ethanol. So we sourced a pump in Cape Town and 35,000 Rand. And I said to the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research and Innovation, I need a pump to make sanitizer. And he said, how much is it? I said, 35,000. He said, buy it. There was no questions asked. And then I needed containers, and these containers you see on the slide here are all water containers that Rhodes had procured to provide water in residences for people when we have what we call water shedding. And it's not only load shedding, we also have water shedding. And so they were sitting doing nothing. So they gave me all those containers. So all of a sudden, some of my container issues for packaging were solved. Sure, we got some mileage out of it. Every time we got a batch made and distributed, we put it on Facebook, we put it on Twitter, we put it on LinkedIn. That brought us some visibility, and the ENCA, a news agency, and SABC came and interviewed me, and there's some video clips on YouTube showing that process. But through that process, and the Pharmacy Council, through that also put us in the Pharmacy Journal. But through that process, we managed to get other people to donate packaging. We got people to donate ethanol and those sorts of things. So the pharmacology lab, which is next door to the lab I was making it, was turned into a warehouse for packaging. And we cleaned all these vessels and installed them there for use. The picture in the middle, here is the lab that we were using, and that's all hand sanitizer ready for distribution. And then on the bottom two pictures show the 5-liter containers with the 25-liter container. So it was a little manufacturing facility that worked well. That was containers that wouldn't necessarily make product, and we had to worry about safety, so storage and those sorts of things was critical. East Cape Department of Health, whilst they received most of the sanitizer, also participated by helping with the distribution and providing us with some of the raw materials when they had. Hydrogen peroxide and glycerol are used in other pharmaceutical products in the hospital, so they were having to make a decision. Well, we might have to use this to make something for patients, or we're not using it, let's make hand sanitizer. So that was the decision that was involved there. The sanitizer, let me leave that, I'll talk to that shortly. So when I was making the sanitizer, we had one overhead stirrer in our faculty, and I had to stir each container for 5 minutes. I'd worked out how long it would be because I'd taken a 25-liter container, filled it with water, added some dye, and I stirred, and I waited to see until the entire dye had distributed, and I said 5 minutes should be sufficient. I wrote a top list email at Rhodes. We have a top list system, and I said to my colleagues at Rhodes, do any of you have an overhead stirrer that I can borrow? And some people responded, we've got a NutriBullet if you want to use it. That wasn't going to work. Those sorts of things. So one of my colleagues, Justin Jonas, who's very involved with the Square Kilometre Array telescope that they're building in Northern Cape, said to his technician, Andy, do you think we can build one of these? Andy Youth had his pictured here, walked across to the building, took a look at what we were using, and then went away, and a day and a half later produced a stirrer. Mounted, albeit looking a bit rustic, but it's mounted to a desk with some clamps, but it stirred at the right speed, and it reduced my manufacturing time from by another 30 minutes, stirring time by 30 minutes. And then sanitizer required ethanol, and through the marketing we did, not the marketing we did, through the exposure, we managed to procure 1,000 liters of ethanol from a private company. They're prepared to pay for it and deliver to Grahamstown 1,000 liters of ethanol. One of these 200 drums is 250 liters, and to make 300 liters of sanitizer, you need 250 liters of ethanol. So it was quite fortuitous in that respect. And then I needed another stirrer, and Separations donated a stirrer. Again, the cost of that stirrer is about 35,000 Rand. The company said, you buy a lot from us for research purposes. This is a good cause. Have a stirrer. So my stirring time had dropped from 1 hour to 30 minutes with the physics stirrer, and then dropped another 10 minutes. You can imagine what that does in terms of the day and saving to be able to produce the 900 liters a day. So that's sort of how the story started and got going. This is an example of the Ubunya Foundation's products. You can see the concern about the plastic bottle looking like a cold drink bottle, looking like water, but the label was an appropriately designed label. And I think when people complained about this, saying, "Oh, you're putting out a sanitizer, it looks like water, or people are going to drink this," I think the argument by Ubunya was our people need, there's no water in some parts of the Eastern Cape, they need to keep their hands clean and sanitize. So this is the only way we can do it, and it's the best way for us to do it at this particular time. So here's some numbers, okay? To date, I've produced over 15,000 liters of sanitizer. If every spray that you use is 1 milliliter, that's 15 million people. Half a milliliter is more likely what a spray would be, that's 30 million people. But it's probably closer to a quarter of a milliliter. That means the entire population of South Africa almost has had one spray of the hand sanitizer produced in that facility. So that's quite amazing. Part of the problem was keeping people motivated. So I had a scoreboard in the lab, and every time we'd made a batch, and we get to 2,000, and we say, okay, the next one is 3,000 liters. We put the batch number and we total it up, and we got to 3,000. They said, okay, the next is 4,000. And so that was the motivation behind people being in there. So those are some volumes. The other interesting thing is that most of the sanitizer, or all of the sanitizer, stayed in the Eastern Cape. Went as far north as Allowal North, as far south as Port Alfred, west, St. Francis Bay and Humansdorp, and east, Matatiwa. So entire East Cape. Every single district got some hand sanitizer. Right, these are the recipients. You can see that there's a variety there. There's some NGOs, there's some non-profit organizations, some of the local medical practitioners. Oh, there's one missing, sorry. TIEMS got some earlier this week. So some people got some in their hand sanitizer in their one of the other important things is that DONE is an agricultural research institute in Stutterheim, and they had labs that were not being used, but they had scientists staying home, not working. So they asked if and we had a relationship with them at Rhodes and MOU, and they asked if I could train their scientists to make hand sanitizer, which we did. And they made 1,200 liters through the training process. And subsequent to that have serviced over 3,000 farmers with hand sanitizer that they make. So their community was also being assisted. It's become a part of an industrial pharmacy elective in our faculty. This is an interesting exercise because I say to the students, you can make sanitizer as part of this process. The question is, who do you want to give it to? And they say to me, well, why do we have to make a decision? You tell us. I said, because there's an ethical dilemma, like who you support in a time of need. So do you give it to the pediatricians, or do you give it to the nurses, or do you give it to the retirement villages? You know, so so they had to take, so there's an ethical consideration for them. And it became a really important learning thing. And one of the important things is that they wrote something on some web page because they'd made the stuff, and they got hold. There was a television program in Cape Town that got hold of the students and wanted to speak to them specifically on TV. Like, why are you doing this? So they got some exposure. So it was another interesting aside in respect of this process. So let's reflect a little bit. I know we're running out of time, and I'll be quick, Roman. Why did I do this? I'm not so sure. Besides the sanity and being able to go to the office. But I gave it some. I think about it all the time. I'm quite amazed at how much we achieved and what we've done. But it was about a community in need, and the community wasn't the general population. For me, the community at the time was the healthcare professionals who were working at the front lines and not being provided with sufficient PPE. I had product development experience, and my research area is I'm interested in scale up and making on a large scale. So it sort of works. So something I could use as an academic, I could use and contribute. And it provided me as a pharmacist with a shared sense of responsibility. I was not able to go and work in a pharmacy. I can do it. I'm registered to do it, but I don't have the current practice. So this is a way of me being able to contribute to this fund. What it also shows is that as academics, we have an ability to translate our skills and experience into something usable and tangible. Focused by thinking a lot on where I want to go with my research subsequently in my last few years of working. And it showed me that I can't do this all. Academics tend to be selfish people who want to do everything themselves. You can't do it yourself. You need to be part of a team. And so I learned that. So you can teach an old dog some new tricks sometimes. It was extremely satisfying. And I sit back and I think, did we actually do that? How did we do that? 15,000 liters is a substantial amount of product. I had to be resourceful. It was frustrating. I'd have materials to make sanitizer, but nothing to pack it in. Or I'd have nothing, I'd have packaging and no material to make sanitizer. Had to motivate people. It's opened up some opportunities in helping people develop business and product skills and entrepreneurial skills. Because I've been able to speak to some people locally in Grahamstown who've heard about this, saying, well, they want to do this, so I can give them some insight. And so we're helping them trying to develop their skills. We put it into the industrial elective. We make some shampoos on a large scale now for the cosmetic elective. We don't make large-scale sanitizer at the moment because the labs are being renovated. I did produce for you, though, so some of you have got it. And the other partnerships that are being explored. I think that in the future, we have to use our teaching and research to capacitate students to be both proactive and reactive in times of need, and not selfish about their own needs, but being more generally aware of global needs or local needs. It's also allowed me to focus, when I do the research projects for the postgrad students, to focus on the processes that are simple and can still be used to make safe and effective products. And I think that skill translates into being able to be used elsewhere. And it's allowed a good partnership between universities, communities, and government, which I think is very important. So I've put these 4 circles up here, teaching and research being the foundation to working with government, universities, and then communities, NGOs, and professionals. But I like alliteration. So I think we should be preparing people with passion for partnerships so they can participate in the planning, prediction, and proactive development of policies. It will create tremendous possibilities for powerful, and unfortunately there's no word, potion wouldn't work, powerful solutions for emergency management. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Look, welcome and good evening, or wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon. Basically, look, this is a very brief presentation on how the floods affected mainly South Australia. So I'll just go this one here. So basically, it's to do it in a matter of time. I think we need to put a bit of context about what the Murray Valley Basin is and why we actually flooded. So that's going to be part of the presentation. It's the second dot right there. and briefly explain how the principles of incident command system used in Australia was used, which we refer to as AIMS. Other places known as LIMS in the US, SIMS in New Zealand, and I know South Africa uses an ICS process as well. So basically, this is an observation from myself for my 8-day rotation. So my 4 8-day rotations in planning and intelligence functions. The information here is all open source. It's from my observations only. There are no confidential or sensitive data related to this flood event. And I've done that deliberately because I thought it was still a bit sensitive in certain areas. So it's not an official, there's no official data or anything like here, or anything else like that here. It's mainly about the way the impacts, and it's more of a summary more than anything else, nothing too deep. Because for that, I would need to sort special permission, and I really think with a time of 15 minutes to do that, wouldn't get it in that time. So basically, this incident started around last year, and just to explain, this is the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, you can see a picture of Australia. You can see that big dump there. It's about 1 million square kilometres. That's about the size of France and Spain, and it's a little bit bigger than Egypt. So you can see it's the actual system is very, very large. And just to give a bit of an idea, that's a system there. And if I use my cursor here, it comes down here, and it comes down through into around here. So you can see there's a lot of rivers, tributaries, and water sources that build into this. Try and give a bit of context as well. As there are most probably in other parts of the world as well, by the way. And we're special in that way. I'm just trying to give you context of how large it is. Another unusual thing is, depending on what side of the border you sit, is what you call the river. On my side of the border, it's known as the Murray River. River Murray. And on the other side, it's known as the Murray River. The reason for that is the way it was actually established many years ago by our 2 early explorers, Charles Sturt and also Human Boyd. So if you see me talk about River Murray or Murray River, you know why. That's a bit of a brief overview there. I think, as I said there, it's the region contains over 30,000 wetlands. It's 70% of Australia's irrigated land area. It covers, as I said before, covers 1 million square kilometres. And it's also, I want to show its most important water catchment areas, provides water to 2.3 million people, has countless habitats and thousands of farms along that line. Basically, we're getting to what caused the floods. As you can see, it's a bit hard to tell, but when I look up here, Charleville, Roma, Toowoomba, St George, that's all Queensland. And then you come down here, that's all New South Wales, and then goes into Canberra. So it's really large. So just some quick statistics to give you an appreciation. The Charleville Warrego River, 900 kilometres long. The Murray River is 2,530 kilometres in total. Now, on the SA side, it's 850 kilometres. Now, I've also seen 865, etc. So I've gone with the standard 850. And essentially, last year, more than 1 year's rainfall occurred in early 2020. So in February 22, Eastern Australia endured 3 intensive weather systems that led to record rains and flooding. By the end of the first week in March, southern Queensland and parts of New South Wales had received the year's rain. There was floodwater swimming around and everything else like that. It was just, there's a photo coming up very shortly to give you some appreciation. And I also understand this is the type of photos that have been witnessed across the world as well. It lasted for months because the rain kept on going. It wasn't just one event in February. It was the event in February that started. There was numerous other rain events that just continued. This is one of the reasons why I decided to call the title The Long Wait, because we knew when you do hydrology, etc., you get a certain amount of rainfall. You can generally follow what the stream's going to be and what the impacts will be, how many gigalitres of water and to flow down the river. But just when you think you've got a handle of it, it kept on raining. And then it stopped, and then it kept on raining in other areas. So the impact was just things to be marking on for a long time. Hence, you know, the heading was the floods are already coming your way. So it started in February. If I go to the next slide, here, that's just the slide in Forbes. Now, Forbes, if I was to go back slides for you, is just here. So you can see there's a fair bit of water, and that's at the beginning, almost of parts of the Murray-Darling Basin. So I'll go back to that. So basically, some basic timelines. Okay, February to March, more than a year amount of rainfall. Then flooding occurred in the upper Murray-Darling Basin. That's a mouthful. It started flooding across Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria all at the same time. The impact we didn't really get to South Australia until later. Early October, an incident management team was established that flows into its own creek. Now, I've got here October. There was a minor one actually the planning started back earlier than that because we knew the water was coming, and the agency responsible for we refer to as the control agency actually were monitoring this and actually set up a very basic IMT, a little bit further than that, but it was still on the principles of an incident management team of monitoring and putting certain plans in place. In October 22, a small level 2 IMT was established, and that's basically the type of system we looked at. Now here, it's not the system. I've done this as a representation. It's not the incident management system because I wasn't prepared to use the actual system because that would mean that I'm using established information that may not be released yet or still under inquiries, etc. So I've done it as this here comes straight out of what we call the AFAC book in my references. Well, so as I said here again, these are examples that represent this management structure, but it's fairly close to the actual structure, but the principles are the same. We have this controller, we have a liaison, and people doing some functions by the incident controller with data, how it's going to affect, and create plans and develop plans and work out how it's going to impact and how they can actually, when it does come, how they're going to do it. So by November 22, the IMT expanded to include a unit within each function, and in mid-November, it continued to expand it to meet the impact. So basically, it grew a bit like that. So once again, this is a larger, like take level 2, almost bordering what we call a level 3. We often refer to it as a state planning incident management team. They created, go back one. They created a levy unit. Now, the reason that actually is a fixture, the reason I wanted to highlight this is this is actually not a normal function with ICS, but this also highlights flexibility that we actually need to have in the AIMS and the ICS system, because really AIMS is an ICS system, so I'm going to refer to it as ICS. It's about meeting the needs. So it doesn't matter what it is. If you've got to have a function, you create the function and you put the other function units underneath it that meet the needs of that incident. In this case, it was a levy unit, and that levy unit dealt with every levies that were built, supported, and how to maintain it to protect it, etc. And then mid-November to January, we had a very large one. Once again, this is not the system, it's an example. It's straight out of the AFAC book, but you can virtually see the structure. But here you'll see where the levy unit was and the levy inspection. I've just added it on. And you also see the planning intelligence who are separated there. This once again highlights it doesn't matter what level, in my view, you create another function. If it needed to be there to meet the needs of the incident, well, create it and run with it. There was a lot of stuff that was done on the run. A lot of things were developed on the run. And in my personal view, that was one of the successes. It was also one of the challenges for a lot of people. Systems were being developed on the run, but were for the better. And in some cases, and with some people's mindsets of you don't develop systems when you're in a major incident, but we have to look at this was a long ongoing incident. We had the time and improved the outcome, in my view, of the system. Now, when we looked at this too, the flows down the river were peaking at, they were going to say about 186,000 gigalitres a day, and they're planning for 250. Just to put that in context, the Murray River normally flows at 4 gigalitres. So you can understand just how large that was running down the river. I'll just capture my quick. Yeah. So general impacts. Now, this is just the general. It's very general. It's like any other flood that occurs anywhere in Australia or over the world. There was a lot of agricultural, grape, wine production, oranges, because in that area we have the riverland. Tourism was a big thing because the River Murray is a place to go over the summer. They lost a full season of business and went further than that, which also included houseboat operators. It's a river where a lot of houseboats operate on, and also people live in their houseboats in that area as well. Of course, hotels, tour operators, etc., couldn't operate because basically it was a lockdown area. Nobody could operate except you could basically you couldn't get anyway. So, whoops. What happened there? What am I going? Whoops, going the wrong way. I don't know what's happening now. Oh, okay. So this and a de-escalation. My apologies. I skipped a bit. A de-escalation, just like I say, mid-January, it started to de-escalate, and you can see the size goes down, and it went down again. And once again, this is a representation of the ICS system about its scalability, etc. It scales up and de-escalates to meet the needs of the incident. And by mid-February, it was down to this section here. Once again, it was not the actual structure. It's a representation that will be used under the ICS. These pictures here I've used from the AFAC book. So basically, that's really about it. These are my all the references and all the information. If you're happy to go through, everything I've got there came from these references and etc.
Well, good morning, everyone. And yeah, thanks for this opportunity to tell you about our work here at the Biotech Innovation Center, as well as working with one of my collaborators, Garth Abrams, in the Department of Biochemistry and Microbiology here at Rhodes University. So as Domin mentioned, what we'll be doing is just kind of discussing a case study of our application of 3D printing to produce a low-cost nucleic acid electrophoresis tool set, but also just looking at 3D printing in general with regards to emergency management, because it's really given me pause for thought, I think, with regards to the emergency context. As Rowan mentioned, it's not really my field, but I think largely I always say we get into the lab and we tend to play, and we play with purpose, hopefully. And yeah, it's good to see that hopefully there's some application to our playing in the lab. Largely just a quick introduction to additive manufacturing or 3D printing. If we look at the concept here of moving from the left of the screen through to the right, we can see how an idea can be drafted using computer-aided design, converted into code in the middle. So you have your G code, which is just a very fancy GPS type of system that controls the computer aided manufacturing device, which is the 3D printer. And hopefully at the end of the day, we end up with an object. In this case, well, a very serious little boat known as Benchy. Benchy over here is just a tool for calibrating our 3D printers. And at the end of the day, we can either implement that design within a application, or at the same time we can iterate upon that design. I think that is really the power of 3D printing when we start looking at distributed and agile manufacturing. So distributed manufacturing really is that principle of having a centralized database, for example, of design models that can reside on a cloud server somewhere, that's accessible to everyone that has access to that cloud server at any given time, allowing them to manufacture a item that they may have downloaded from the server, which is effectively just code, and that code can be translated into a physical object using any of the technologies that are available to those individuals in whatever location they may find themselves in. Agile manufacturing, on the other end of the scale, is a responsive principle, a case of, well, a single user producing an object, that object then hopefully being applied to multiple users, and at the same time, those multiple users can feed back immediately to that initial designer in order to modify the design for their own purposes. So you could have purpose-built, personalized application of those tool sets. And of course, with distributed manufacturing, this could be rolled out in a large scale. So it's highly scalable in terms of technologies. And that, of course, became quite important in COVID-19 with regards to the supply chain disruptions that we saw. In fact, I mean, as a laboratory scientist, principal investigator, the supply chain disruptions are still affecting us to this day in terms of how supply chains have changed, how testing has changed, how raw materials might not have been available or are still quite rare. But during the pandemic, the 3D printing community really had its time to shine in that what we saw, of course, was that there was an absolute lack of PPE, not enough PPE stockpiled, not enough PPE available for manufacture, not enough PPE available in individual countries. And the 3D printing hobbyist community sprung into action really by producing those PPE. And it was always heartening to see stories of nurses, for example, that would respond to a hobbyist to say, well, this face shield or this mask or this clamp isn't fitting really well. Can you modify it? And the modification could be would happen on the fly and could be rolled out in mass or on a small scale, depending on the batch. You had a point where we would see large scale manufacturers producing, for example, nasopharyngeal swabs using 3D printers in order to keep up with demand for the during this testing. And we also saw the application, not really, I wouldn't say wholesale application. 3D printing of isolation wards in houses is really still, I would say, in its infancy. And hopefully all of this really does prepare us for that next pandemic, because, well, there is always something out there. More locally, we contributed, our Maker Lab contributed to producing some face shields for our local frontline workers. And it was actually quite nice to see. Recently, I went to my GP and he was still using his face shield and just updating the actual visor between patients as well. Now, there are pros and cons to this entire process, of course. With the pros of 3D printing, we have this iterative, agile, responsive design. It's highly scalable in terms of being distributed around the globe. And of course, accessibility depends on internet access. And by the very nature of agile or additive manufacturing, there should be very little post-processing that is required. In fact, I think one of the use cases was the proposed use of 3D printing implements in a surgical environment, where because of the temperatures at which these objects are printed, it was proposed that it would, in essence, come off of the printer in a sterile environment already. So it could be used immediately within an emergency environment. Of course, the cons, as we saw with the pandemic and the rise of 3D printers, was quality control, because we had lots of upstarts that would suddenly start printing off objects and buying printers in order to sell objects and make a quick buck. Resulted in some shoddy prints being released into the environment. And of course, that does affect the potential usability of that item of PPE. Material sourcing, of course, becomes an issue because, during a pandemic, you have a point where materials are limited. And getting materials to individual users could also prove quite difficult. In fact, that is exactly what has happened, or what had happened in a lot of cases. But there is a workaround to that, in that there are systems that allow you to actually go and recycle plastic bottles. For example, the polyethylene phthalate bottles that are used for Coca-Cola bottles could actually be repurposed into a 3D printing filament material. So there's a recycling aspect to it that could work into these processes. And something that I generally view that is linked quite closely to that quality issue is training. Having people adequately trained in the technologies, hobbyists or professionals, of course, does mean that we can implement this technology further. And that is really kind of where we kind of started looking at the problem. We've been 3D printing in and out of the lab for various applications since the early 2010s. And I then challenged the students with the help of my colleague, Dr. Abrams, who came up with the idea, was to say, well, what happens if we require an item of equipment in the laboratory at short notice? It takes us a couple of weeks from a point of order during normal times in order to get a piece of equipment to the lab. What about in a point of crisis? So what we looked at was really the agarose gel electrophoresis units, and thought, well, it's basically a piece of plastic that has some electrodes inserted into it that allows us to separate nucleic acids based on the charge, so establishing an electric field, and we can separate DNA or RNA in order to analyze the DNA based on size. For example, if we are implementing it in a PCR, a polymerase chain reaction, we can look for positive results and compare it to negative results, and we can do multiple samples at a given time. Of course, these units are quite expensive, so that also added a little bit of impetus to developing the system, in that we then challenged the students to design a unit that allowed us to miniaturize it, to run the agarose gels on microscope slides. So more or less reducing the amount required by a factor of 10. And we created what's known as the agarose gel 3D toolkit, which is the shortened AG3D. The principles being that we could reduce the cost, but also hopefully increase access. This was simply designed in a computer-aided design program, in this case, freely available SketchUp, made by a company called Trimble. And we thought, well, in terms of the electrodes, we could either go the traditional route, which was to use a platinum wire, which is used in the traditional systems, or we could just use little banana plugs. These banana plugs are copper-based. They're usually used in audio jacks and little electrical connectors, and they're fairly cheap. And of course, copper conducts electricity quite well. The matrix through which the agarose, or through which the gels are done, or the nucleic acids are done, is composed of agadose. And that agadose is usually a molecular biology grade agadose. It's fairly expensive. So having a smaller amount used within the sample would also allow things to go a bit further. So simply, the principle being that we could cast this onto a glass slide. The glass slide, or clean glass slide, would have a certain amount of surface tension combined with the surface tension of the molten agadose. And we could basically have that glass slide establishing the borders of the electrophoretic construct, and we would have a reduction in cost with regards to the amount of buffer used, as mentioned, 10 times less, as well as a reduction in the amount of sample that we would also use, which is up to a fifth less of a sample. That becomes quite important when you're looking at rare samples, for example, samples where you don't want to waste too much in terms of the analysis, if you're wanting to use for further processes. Of course, the proof is in the pudding. It's to see whether or not we actually have something that is viable as a product, is actually to compare it to the commercial systems. And as we can see here with the commercial systems in two different buffers, we can actually see that our system tends to outperform the commercial system in terms of separation of smaller fragments of DNA, allowing us to apply a much wider spectrum of separation for analysis of samples. So that added to a bigger win for the actual technology that was developed, apart from the cost reduction. An average gel tank, for example, might cost $100 comparative. In our case, in the South African context, anything from 2,500 Rand all the way up to 11,000 Rand. And having something that's produced at $2.28 on average does go quite a long way. So $5 maybe in total with the banana plugs. Now, 3D printing, of course, actually has applications in other fields as well. And as mentioned by Roman, my main field is in tissue engineering. And we are quite involved in producing and modifying printers for bioprinting purposes. And this is largely an application of the printing technology to applying the printers and the controlled deposition of materials for application in the use of patterning biomaterials. So biomaterials, of course, being any material that is has a biological origin, that could be, for example, the agadose that might be used within a gel electrophoresis system, all the way through to the gelatin that is used potentially to produce tissue constructs that could be applied as a tissue patch in a surgical environment. Being in South Africa, of course, means that the technology is usually quite expensive. Yeah, one of the things that I like to do is to actually find slightly cheaper options to allow for increased access and to increase the user base of a technology. In this case, what we did was to take a commercial 3D printer and modify it in order to make a lower cost hydrogel microextrusion platform to allow us to perform bioprinting of various materials. And as we can see here, we have our CAD models translated into three-dimensional or semi-complex three-dimensional objects that allow for further use within a laboratory or in a, hopefully, a pharmaceutical or a medical application, a biomedical application. The idea again being that if we can develop the lower cost bioprinters, in this case here, we have a Delta printer that student Sydney Fanucci modified and developed some internal modifications to the system. at the hardware and software levels, and allowed us simply to print what we term the wetware. And in this case, what we have here is a patch of biomaterial known as gelatin and alginate composite, and this allows us to create these controlled patches that could, for example, be applied into a controlled system for a tissue patch to be used on in a application, for example, in a surgical ward, or in our case, we apply it in localized drug discovery. So looking at applying the systems to test out novel drugs by having mammalian cells grow within the constructs, and then seeing how they respond to the drugs within a three-dimensional environment, largely because, well, we are three-dimensional, and traditional drug discovery is performed in a two-dimensional system. So these printers become quite powerful tools in that, basically allowing us potentially to apply it within a laboratory environment, but at the same time within a biomedical application, you have the potential to produce personalized pharmaceuticals in terms of personalized formulations, looking at small batches of custom pills. You could have custom tissue patches that are produced per patient. Of course, more of a niche, but as cellular agriculture starts to grow as a field, 3D printed foods as well the 3D printers would find application within that. And despite every bioprinter telling you that, yes, we can print organs, no, we can't at this point in time. A future application of these printers could be 3D printed organs. So in terms of shortages and personalization, these technologies would find a lot of use and application. And yeah, I think that's my story. I'd just like to, well, as a principal investigator who gets to sit in his office all day long, we have to thank the students that actually do the work. Matthew Barwick, Sydney Finucci, Siso Mabanka, Kanisila Buthelezi, and our collaborator, Dr. Michael Chooks, and of course, the people who give us the money in order to allow us to continue with our laboratory shenanigans, National Research Foundation, SAMRC, and our university. Thank you.